Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on in Unit 3 talking over the topic of identification. Last time we were talking about ethnicity as a form of identification in the way that we identify with a larger group based upon our cultural characteristics, and today we're going to talk about race. Now, historically, a lot of times race and ethnicity were very closely tied together, and that made sense because when you looked at groups of people by race, a lot of times that lined up with their ethnicity because different groups of people lived in specific parts of the world and they participated in certain cultural elements or cultural attributes. And so historically, we've seen this really close tie between race and ethnicity. What's happened is we moved on and globalization has taken place and people are moving to different parts of the world. People different from different racial groups and ethnic groups are blending together and making families, and things are becoming much more complicated. No longer do you just have groups of people separated all over the world participating in different cultures, and they all pretty much look the same and participate in those cultures. Now we have people moving into new regions of the world, different groups of people participating in different cultural elements, people converting to different religions, taking on different foodways or folk cultures or whatever. So both race and ethnicity are becoming much harder to find. But just like ethnicity, race is often used to classify groups of people for a variety of different reasons. If you think about the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. Census Bureau uses race in order to classify groups of people where they're living, and so you can kind of get an idea of the distribution of groups of people in the United States. When we look at school data, we break our students down by race to see how different groups within the school are performing. Um, when we look at political polling, in fact, the midterm elections are coming up next Tuesday, and talk about the different types of voters. So that's broken down by race because different voting blocks tend to go a particular way. So race is often used to classify groups of people, section them off to kind of study them and look at them. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But now, a lot of times the reason that race is used as opposed to ethnicity is that race is much easier to define. It's much easier to identify um, because race is solely based on someone's outward appearance. We base race based upon typically skin color, hair type, nose and eye shape. And those are the things we look to when we try to identify a person's race. And again, it's much easier to identify somebody's race typically than their ethnicity. Typically, all I do is I look at someone and I can guess what race they are. But in fact, if I had to identify the ethnicity of somebody, actually I'd have to talk to them and get to know them and begin to understand who they were. And so it's a much more shallow, a lot of times a lot more shallow understanding of who a person is. So when we talk about identity, this is kind of the way that things have gotten complicated, is because in the past we've liked to group racial groups together and identify them by their race and say, well, if they're of that race, then they will behave this particular way. And now we know that that's not necessarily the case. That was the old way of thinking, and now we know that's not necessarily the case. Again, oftentimes race is used to create division within society. And again, a lot of times it's used to create divisions because it's very easy to see. It's easy to point out and say, well, that person is different. And so you know those are the people that you're looking for, especially when you're trying to create some sort of artificial division. So some examples I have here are just this top sign is a sign from apartheid South Africa um, the talking about the places that were available for white, for blacks, but then you also had groups that were called coloreds, and those were you had areas that were for the people from India, also people of mixed race, and so they even did it by varying degrees of color. The bottom picture is a picture from the Jim Crow South era, where establishments were divided up among racial groups for white and for black. And again, throughout throughout history, for the most part, that's what race has been used for. It's been used as a method of division to divide people, to separate them, to make them feel hostile towards one another. And so, race kind of becomes kind of an uneasy topic for us to talk about. Now, it was interesting. We actually had a guest speaker in my classroom earlier this year. He's from the U.S. Census Bureau, and he was talking about some of the ways that race can be helpful, especially when it comes to genetics. Um, uh, this this idea that when we look at the genetic makeup of different races of people, some of them have certain tendencies towards maybe certain health conditions, and he mentioned that Black and Hispanic populations tend to, I believe it was prostate cancer. They have higher rates of prostate cancer, and so if you know where higher rates of Hispanic and Black populations are, then you can know where you're most likely to find higher rates of certain types of illnesses, and so then you as a community can begin to plan for that. And so using race in that way might be a way that is both beneficial but also positive. But again, typically, we've tried to get beyond race in our society, to look beyond those things as someone's characteristic. But again, historically and even today, sometimes people try to use race as a way to identify a person and place that identity on someone. Because you are of this particular race, either you can or you cannot do certain things. And certainly historically, it's been that case. If you were a certain color, you couldn't participate in certain activities. If you were a certain color, then you were, destined to this particular section of in society. And you look at across the entire world, that's the way that it is. Even within India, light-skinned people versus dark-skinned people. In China, light-skinned people versus dark-skinned people. They have used that, and across the world, that it's been used as a method of separation for people within space. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about for race. When we come back next time, we will talk about gender as a form of identification.